Gotcha. So this is just a little bit of information about me. I've been in IT field for over 30 years. I've been in Council Rock School District for 18. What's interesting about Council Rock as an environment is that half of my customers are also trying to hack my network as well as anyone outside the network. So it's created a unique opportunity for me to study and learn about cybersecurity. This just gives you a kind of a blueprint of what the district is like. We have over 10,000 Chromebooks now deployed. That number's off a little bit. We moved to a one-to-one during the pandemic, which created its own challenges. We went from supporting 18 schools to 18 schools plus 20,000 households. So, and my entire department, including myself, is made up of 9 people. So a little bit of a challenge. But what we're here today is talk about how to conduct an information security risk assessment. In today's world, this is something that you can pay to have someone do, but I recommend you do it yourself first, then pay someone to come in and do it and see how your audit matches theirs. And a lot of people are afraid of audits, especially when you say information security risk audit, because the problem comes up in terms of what are they going to find that I'm doing wrong? Am I going to get fired? And I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think the way to look at it is what can I learn from this? Here's a terrific opportunity for somebody to come in from the outside, look at my organization with fresh eyes, and what can they teach me that I don't know that I should be doing in my current environment. But in order to understand what a risk assessment is, we kind of got to start with the basics. So what is risk? Well, risk comes from the Latin riscum, which means danger, venture, crisis. In Italian, risk means to hazard, adventure, jeopardize. In French, it means peril, jeopardize, hazard, chance, adventure. And risk, it means in English, it's peril, jeopardy, danger, hazard, all pretty much the same thing. Something that could lead itself to something bad happening. A couple of studies out there about risk. And what I found when I did my research is that whoever is writing the definition of risk is writing it from their lens. And that in a lot of worlds, a lot of opportunities, there are a lot of different ways to define risk. And if you talk to an actuary, they'll tell you the same thing. You know, you define risk differently for different businesses based on what they're trying to put together. But a risk assessment is really an exercise in measurement. What you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out what are the things in your environment that are important. And if they're important, what are the things that could do to jeopardize those particular items? Without some kind of a risk assessment process, you can't identify risks. You can't measure your level of exposure. And measuring your level of exposure is critical for when you're trying to define your budget. If you have an item that costs $10,000, and if it gets compromised, it's going to cost the organization $10,000, and you can budget some type of an item to protect that for $1,000, it's kind of a no-brainer. And if you have an item that costs $10 and it costs $100 to protect it, that's also a no-brainer. You're not going to budget to protect it. Okay. You can't protect against possible dangers if you don't know what they are. You don't really know what the dangers are if you don't know what it is you're trying to protect. Okay. And then you can't measure the possible dangers without some kind of a risk assessment. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to say that risk is a situation or event that exposes an object or an asset to harm, an outcome. Okay. Event is a chance or situation that's possible but not certain. An asset is a direct or indirect target of an event, and the outcome is the impact of the event. Risk is measured basically on the probability of uncertainty, so the likelihood of an event occurring. And I always use a zombie apocalypse as an example of this. Most of us aren't prepared, well, maybe not, based on the Walking Dead popularity. Most of us are not prepared for a zombie apocalypse. And yet the CDC has a document on there on how to prepare for a zombie apocalypse. And it's a tongue-in-cheek way of their trying to prepare you for something like a pandemic. And it's interesting to see, if you go back and look at that document, the things that they told you to do are the things that we needed during the current pandemic crisis. So what are the components of risk? There are basically 4 components. Future event, which could be an action or inaction, the probability of that event happening, the asset itself, and then the impact. So if you take the NIST document, and we're going to talk about the framework in a little bit, and you take a look at it, it actually lists some of the impacts that occur when an event happens. An information security risk is based on the threat, the vulnerabilities, and the impact. So the threat is the event, the vulnerability, a weakness that increases the probability of the threat being successful, and then the impact. Now, I'm throwing a lot of definitions at you. Hopefully by the end of the presentation, they'll all kind of work together and you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. Okay. We know that cybersecurity is that sweet spot between functionality and security. You can make something so secure, but then it can't be used. And then you can have things that are easy to use, but then they're not secure. So cybersecurity is that sweet spot. But information security risk assessment is based 100% on the CIA triad. Confidentiality, maintaining integrity, and maintaining availability. Those are the three measures that an information security risk assessment should be centered around. Okay. In order for us to protect something, obviously we need to know what it is. So you basically have to start off with an assessment of what are your assets? What are the things that you're trying to protect? If you have a file server that contains PII data, you're going to want to protect that. If you have like in Council Rock, we have workstations and computer labs that the kids access all day long. If something happens to one of those machines, I just reimage it. I don't do any kind of investigation. I don't look to see if it, is spread anywhere else, because those machines are on a particular network, so that if they do get compromised, I can just reimage them. I'm not worried about doing any kind of investigation. However, if someone in the administrative offices has an issue with their machine and it looks like it might have been compromised somehow, then I am going to do an investigation. So there's a difference in terms of the resources that I'm willing to allocate to those assets based on compromised or the risks to those assets. Once you've identified, once you've gone through the beginning process and you're looking at all of the different assets that you have, you can also take a look at the financial impacts of the risks to those. You can determine the budget that you're going to need for protections and resources. For example, all of us probably have some kind of a firewall in place. Someone at some point had to budget for that firewall. Budgeting for that firewall, part of that process should have included evaluating firewalls. What protections do I need? And what kind of protections will I get with the device that I implement? It's all part of the whole process. And when you're looking from an information security risk assessment standpoint, one of the things you want to look at is planning for the future. A lot of companies and organizations that I've come into contact with that have had an event, they have been breached. They're all anxious to spend money on a resource that will protect them from that particular breach. Instead, what they should be looking at is on an internal side, what processes and procedures were they lacking that enabled that breach to occur? And then what kind of devices or software or hardware or purchases are they going to make that not only protect them from that breach, but from other breaches as well? They need to take a holistic approach. A lot of companies don't do that because they're reactive. Now that's starting to shift a little bit as more and more requirements are coming in for organizations. They have to reach a minimum level of cybersecurity. They have to have some kind of minimum level. A lot of the insurance companies that are providing cyber liability insurance are focusing on what are the protections in place. And doing your own information security risk assessment will help you discover the kinds of things that you need to make sure that you're in place. So what are some of the frameworks out there for risk assessment? There's ISO 27005, NIST SP 800-30, which I highly recommend if you're thinking about doing an information security risk assessment on yourself. You definitely read this document. It is excellent. You have to, with the NIST documents, be willing to make modifications, to modify them a little bit to make them work in your environment, and that's okay. That's what the NIST guidelines are for. That's why they're called guidelines. There's FAIR, the factor analysis of information risk. That's a really good one to have. Octave is a good framework as well for risk assessments. ENISA is a European framework. CRAM is also a European framework. EBIOS is another European framework. And then Risk IT is from ISACA, and that's also an excellent framework to take a look at. So there's no lack of resources out there in terms of information. If you're having trouble sleeping at night, these are all excellent reads. But there are 6 core activities for doing an information security risk assessment. And this is just based on my experience over the years doing these types of things. First thing you need to do is identify your assets. What are your crown jewels? Then you've got to identify for each of those assets the vulnerabilities. Then once you've identified the vulnerabilities, then you need to identify the threats. So of those vulnerabilities, who's going to try to take advantage of them? Where are those threats going to come from? Then you have to determine the impact. And I apologize for the noise in the background if you can hear that. The walls are very thin in my office. You have to determine the impact. What happens if a threat is realized? What happens if that asset becomes compromised? What's the financial impact to the organization? What are the operational impacts to the organization? Then you have to determine the likelihood of the threat actually occurring. If you're looking at, for example, in Council Rock School District, script kiddies are a big problem for me. I have kids go home, they watch YouTube videos, they copy stuff to USB drives, they come in, plug it into a machine and try to execute it. If you're in an insurance company or a bank, script kiddies probably on the inside aren't really a problem for you. They may be, but they're not as large as they are for someone who works in a school district. Okay. And the last thing you want to do, and this is probably, in my opinion, the most critical part, is identify the controls that you have in place right now to mitigate the vulnerabilities on those assets. We're going to talk about that in a lot more detail here in a second. I think that you should take a look at all of the different frameworks. I think you should come out from those frameworks with a framework for yourself that works for your organization, because not every organization is the same. If you're a large company, you probably have an entire department that does nothing but information security risk, where they've got 7, 8, 10 people. Plenty of time, plenty of resources to do that. But if you're a small organization and you are the entire IT department, some of the processes and procedures that you would love to put in place, you don't have the staff for, nor do you have the wherewithal to be able to implement these simply because the organization itself couldn't support it. So what you need to do is you need to come up with something that's easy to implement, manage and maintain, and is easily defensible. If someone asks, why are you doing that? You can go back to the framework and say, well, best practice frameworks say we should be doing this. And we're going to be doing this because in our environment, doing this will provide us this level of security, this level of protection. No organization will be completely risk-free. The only computer that is absolutely free from risk is one that's never set up, one that's still in the box is never opened, it's taped shut, it's never turned on. That computer is, I've got a 99.9% assurance that that computer is not compromised unless it was compromised at the factory where it was put together. But you don't know that. So whatever methodology you come up with, it's going to consist of some different steps. There's going to be some type of data collection. There's going to be some type of data analysis. Then you're going to take that information, you're going to take a look at risk. You're going to do the risk analysis, you're going to do prioritization, and you're going to come up with treatments for those risks. You have to come up with some way to report that, and then you have to figure out how are you going to maintain this information. You can't go through your organization, do an information security risk assessment, and say, okay, we're done. And then 20 years when I retire, it's the next guy's problem. When you do your information security risk assessment, you're going to have findings. Those findings are going to require you to do something on the inside of your organization. Well, as soon as you do that something, your organization's posture has changed. Now you have to go back and do the information security risk assessment again because you're now looking at something different. What I recommend, you don't have to do it right away. What I recommend is you do an information security risk assessment yourself internally after you've analyzed the frameworks and come up with it. And then you take, as much time as makes sense for you to go through the results, to put the processes in place, to put the procedures in place. And when you think you're at a good point, do it again. That could be a month, that could be 6 months, 18 months, 24 months. It depends, once again, on the resources that you have available. But part of the process that you need when you do that is to identify, all right, what is our targeted maintenance schedule? How often are we going to go back and take a look at what we've done? So how does data collection work? Well, there's all kinds of information that you can use to get data. Obviously, your system profiles, your control profiles. Remember, I mentioned those controls before. I'm going to talk about them more a little bit later. Any previous audit reports that were done either internally or externally. Any vulnerability assessments. Any kind of information security events and metrics. If you're running a SIM, what kind of information is that generating? If you've got a help desk system, what kind of information can you collect from the help desk system? All important information, all important resources that you can use. Okay. As you're going through the data, there's kind of what I call 4 buckets that I put the data into. Findings, we don't have any kind of a password policy. to make people change their password. That's kind of a finding. Any information that I collect about assets goes in another bucket. Any information about risks that I come across goes into another bucket. And then any kind of reference data that I come across, like if I find a user manual or I find a process, procedure, or something that doesn't fit in the other three buckets, I'm just going to put it in my reference data. If you put stuff in the findings, we're talking about audit statements, descriptions, assets, sources, risk rating, status, and systems. Assets, when you're collecting the asset, you want to make sure that you're identifying the name, classification, profile. And when I say asset classification, is it a system? Is it an end user system? How are you what kind of classifications is it? Is it a top secret system? Is it secret? Is it confidential? Is it public use? You know, whatever classification system that you've come up with internally based on those frameworks, you want to stick to that. Because what it does is it lends credence to the information security risk assessment, because you can go back and say, look, we created these classifications. What you should be seeing right now is that before you do the information security risk assessment, there's a lot of legwork that you'll need to get ready for it. And that's not a bad thing either, because that's forcing you to take a look through a different lens at your organization. Okay. Then you want to take a look at risk. Is a risk to the asset? Is a risk to the application? What are the potential threats? Do you have disgruntled employees? That's a threat. Are you located on the beach? Tsunamis, is that a threat? Do you live in Tornado Alley? That's a threat. What kind of vulnerabilities are there? What's the impact? What are the likelihoods? What kind of controls do you have in place? If you don't have any controls, that's easy. There's no controls. But if you have like group policies applied throughout the organizations, those are controls to help keep things protected. And then, of course, we get back to, once again, defining the risks. And then reference data can be a threat catalog. There are lots of different threat catalogs. If you look through those resources, and I'll make this slide deck available to Owen later, and I think he's going to post that to the webpage, so you'll have access to these and the references later. But those references, some of them have threat catalogs. There's vulnerability catalogs. Documentation request list, that's important. Does your organization already have procedures in place? Do they have policies in place? Well, you want those because you're going to be testing against those. If we have a policy that says that we need to do this, keep the information security safe, and from that policy, we've got these procedures that say we're going to do this, this, and this, and this, check and see if they're being done. Okay. Whatever data sources you have, identify those. Your asset inventory, did you just take a spreadsheet from someone who said these are all of our assets? How did you validate that? How do you know that that's correct and true? Then you take a look at interview notes. As you go through the process, you're going to be talking to people. I would think you'd be talking to people. Hey, how often do you change your password? That sort of thing. And you can actually put together the types of interview questions you're going to ask. Once again, we're looking at trying to provide consistency. And these are just a list of some of the documents we talked about before. Disaster recovery plans, business continuity plans. I think we're all familiar with business continuity plans, thanks to the pandemic. Any kind of inventory systems you have, any kind of security processes and procedures, any kind of roadmaps that you may have. If you have hardening guidelines or checklists when you build a server, all of our servers are built according to this or that or the other thing. You know, those are all definitely things that you can do. When you do your asset inventory, you want to look at, you know, are they enterprise applications? Are they just one person using the application? Because that changes what the impact and what the threat is if those applications become compromised. Now, if one person's using just one application and he's the only one who uses it, but it has a lot of PII data, the risk is still very high. Okay? You want to look at databases, software, hardware, basically anything that's there that you're looking at in terms of if it stores information, and that information, if it gets out, could be some kind of a risk to the organization, or if it gets corrupted. All of that information is part of your assets. Okay. And these are just some of the fields. Like if you're thinking, Matt, that looks like headers from an Excel spreadsheet. That's because these would make excellent headers on an Excel spreadsheet. Control inventory. What's a control? Controls are the things that you put in place and say, all right, if I have data that's secure, I need to know that it's encrypted from point A to point B. And if it's PII data, I want to make sure that it's encrypted at rest. Well, what kind of controls do you have in place to make sure that that happens? And if you don't have controls, here's an opportunity for you to create controls. And that's kind of one of the benefits of doing an information security risk assessment. If you realize that there are no controls in place to keep things secure, then it's an opportunity for you to create those controls. And once again, lots of documentation out there to help you create those types of controls. But those controls then have to be documented either in a procedure manual, an SOP manual. There needs to be something in place so that someone can come in and say, all right, well, what are your controls for making sure that the data is encrypted at rest? And you open up and there's a policy, and there's a policy that's referenced, there's the procedure, there's the step-by-step guidelines. All right, these are the controls that we should be following. So if someone comes in and implements a database, and that database is going to contain info, part of the implementation of that database has to be the question, how are we going to encrypt the data at rest? And all of these things are designed, once again, to make your system more secure. And these are all just general questions that you're going to ask in terms of the control inventory. Backups, that's a big one. Are your backups being done on a regular basis? Are your backups secure? How do you know you're secure? Do the backups work? How often do you do a restore? Are you creating immutable backups? An immutable backup is a backup that cannot be written to. So there's no way ransomware can encrypt that backup because it can't be written to. It can only be copied back in and restored. So are you doing immutable backups? And you should be in this day and age. Are the systems secured physically? I was doing an audit at a municipality in New Jersey, and the closet with all of their servers was not in the lobby, but was in the room next to the lobby that anybody could pretty much walk through. And it was a cabinet, and it had a nice lock on it. It had the key in the lock, and the door was open. So physical security, not so much. So how do we do a data analysis once we've got all this data? You're basically going to compile observations and documents. You're going to take a list of the issues that you have from previous assessments or audits. You're going to document what controls are in place. You're going to take a look at the procedures and processes. You're going to look at one of the things that when I say observations, one of the things that's critical there is a lot of times people who've been in an organization for a long period of time develop what's called tacit knowledge. And there are things that they do on a regular basis that aren't necessarily in a procedure, not necessarily written down as a process or an SOP, but they're things that they do because it makes their life easier, but it makes the business run smoother. Those are the kinds of things that you can observe and you can document and say, hey, you know what? You guys do this. This is really good, but you can't get any credit for it because it's not written down. Because if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Okay. The whole idea behind this whole process is to basically paint an accurate picture of the organization as it is right now. You're going to go back to that and say, this is what you guys are doing right now today. Is it what you should be doing? Okay. Remember that a risk is a situation that exposes an object to harm. When we talk about assets, it's the direct or indirect target of the event. For example, if I'm doing social engineering on the receptionist is the asset that is the direct target of my social engineering. I'm trying to get her username and password or whatever it is that I'm trying to do. So when we look at risk, it is a measurement of the probability of uncertainty. In other words, probability is the likelihood of an event occurring. Is your receptionist likely to be social engineered? And the answer is yes, because we know from studies that a receptionist, help desk people, mid-level managers, those are the high targets for social engineering because they're the ones that, for whatever reason, are easily compromised. Okay. Once you've identified what all the assets are, now you can take a look at the controls. I actually witnessed the other day, the receptionist where I work, gentleman came in, looked like a technician from Siemens. She called downstairs. He was expected. She opened the door and let him into the building with no guidance to get down to where he needed to go or anything. Now, I've seen the guy here before, so I knew it was legit. But I walked over to her and I said, do you know this guy? And she said, no. And I said, why did you let him into the rest of the building? Well, because downstairs said it was okay. I said, I get that, but did they check to see who it was? Basically had to retrain her and she goes, oh, you're right. I said, I know it's a pain. Make them come up and get the person. Okay. Once you've figured out what the assets are, you want to rank them. This is just an example of a scale. Your scale can vary. Rank them as not important, not very important, important, very important, or critical. Those are kind of the five, and you can use whatever scale that you want. But for my exercises, this is kind of what I use. Okay. You want to develop your own threat catalog, and your threat catalog is going to be pretty much specific to you. When I say specific to you, I'm talking about your organization. BSI Calculator has a threat catalog. There's Microsoft Threat Model has a threat catalog, although that threat catalog is more geared toward development than anything else. NIST SP 800-30 also has some threat catalogs in it as well. And then, of course, ISO 2705 has a bunch too. This is an example of a threat catalog listing. So we look at, for example, natural disasters. In the case of computing centers, blah, 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 blah. So this is an example of a threat catalog. And you can start with the generic threat catalog, and then you can refine it for your environment. For example, we live in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania does experience earthquakes. But we haven't, at least in the last 100 years or so, had an earthquake strong enough to cause physical damage to a building, at least not in the general area where I'm located. So earthquakes, while they're a natural disaster, may not be high on my list of threats. Once again, your threat catalog, you can break it down into a threat agent and then a threat action. Once again, it boils down to what you're trying to identify and how you're trying to identify it. So once you've identified your vulnerability catalog, by the way, last year, 94% of security breaches occurred through phishing. Of those 94% of those breaches, 84% could have been stopped if things had been patched. Looks like I have a question. Looks like a lot of paperwork, probably in big binders. So is there a lot of CYA? How do improvements happen? Well, that's a difficult question. The improvement happened as a result of the exercise. The danger here is to thinking, okay, I'm going to do an information security risk assessment. I should have this done in a week. It's kind of like trying to eat an elephant one bite at a time. It's going to take you a long time to eat an elephant. Same thing with something like this. What you'll do is look at the parts and think to yourself, okay, well, what can I start with? And one of them might be identifying your assets. What are the assets that you have? Take a couple of weeks and put that together and then rank those assets. If you haven't done that before, it's a good exercise. Once you've identified your assets, now maybe you can start to dive in a little bit deeper. Well, why are these assets important? How do people access these assets? So what I would say is improvements will happen over time, and it depends on how much resources you have and what you're willing to dedicate to this. One of the advantages of bringing in an outside firm to do this is they'll force you to do things. You know, you can start this process, and if you're relying on your own internal resources, everybody gets busy. It's not a priority. It can take you forever. Here at Council Rock, it took me forever to get through the first information security risk assessment. When I say forever, it took me about 3 years because there just isn't enough staff for anyone to spend full time on this. So we would fit this in bit by bit by bit. But eventually we got to a point where we could do one. I hope that answers your question, Mike. Or Michelle, I'm sorry. Should really get better glasses. Okay, what you do once you've identified your threats, you want to pair the threat to the vulnerability. And this is an example from one of the frameworks that I showed you earlier, where it shows you the threat is the user, eavesdropping, interception of data, and the vulnerability is lack of transmission encryption leading to interception of unencrypted data. So when you do your risk computation, we've identified the assets, we've identified the threats, we've identified the vulnerabilities. Now we have to determine the impact, we have to determine the controls, we have to determine the likelihood. So how do you do an impact analysis? Well, look at how confidentiality is impacted, look at how integrity is impacted, look at how availability is impacted. What we do first is we classify the information. Executive only, top confidentiality level, confidential, restricted, internal use, public. Once again, this is a guide, this is the scale that I use, but you could use any scale that you want. When you look at the integrity score, so basically what we do is we classify the information, then we calculate an integrity. Is very high integrity, is business critical and financially material. So that data, if it was compromised, would have an impact to the financial and the business information is critical. Then we took a look at availability. Is it business critical and the number of users? So if it's like our purchasing system, or I guess our finance system, it's used by a lot of people and it is very business critical. And then how do you calculate the impact score? Well, for each asset, you develop the associated threat and vulnerability pairs. For each threat and vulnerability pair, you assign a confidentiality, integrity, and availability score. Whichever of these three scores is highest becomes the impact score for that threat or vulnerability pair. So in this particular example, going back again to the users, eavesdropping and interception, okay, my confidentiality score was a 5, my integrity was a 0, my availability was a 0, so my impact score would be a 5. In the second example, it's a 550, the impact score is 5. Once again, this exercise is just so that you can present to management, I don't want to say objective numbers, but you're getting objective numbers from a subjective application, but it's a consistent application. If someone says, how did you get that score? You can pull it out and say, well, this is how I ranked it. If you disagree with me, that's fine, but you just need to explain to me why you think the score should be a 4 instead of a 5. Then what you do is for each threat and vulnerability pair, you identify what, if any, controls are in place. So if there's a very strong control in place, I give it a ranking of a 5. If there's no control in place, I give it a ranking of 1, which would be very weak. So then you can take for each of your threat and actions, your vulnerabilities, you identify the control, and then you give the control a score. Trust me, we're going somewhere with this. Okay. Then we want to take a look at exposure. What is your exposure? Very likely, there have been previous compromises or attempts have been detected, or very unlikely. It really falls outside the above. There's, it's a standalone system. There's no network access. There's really no exposure to the system. And most of us don't have very many of those. Most of us have systems that are at least on the network. But once again, what does that system do? How exposed is it? How deep in your network do you have to go to get to that? Frequency. How frequency do you think you'll have an attack? For example, brute force attacks on Office 365. For me, that happens daily. Actually, a lot daily. Okay. So zombie apocalypse, probably very unlikely. Likelihood. How likelihood is it? The exposure, frequency, and control. So I take the exposure plus the frequency divided by 2, and I times it by the reverse control score. That's only to normalize the data. Did I do that? So what happens is we take that same threat and action, we take that vulnerability, we take the exposure, the frequency, and the control, and the likelihood. Once again, we're taking data that we have subjectively said our exposures are 3, but we're giving it a ranking. It allows us to come up with numbers. Okay. So at this point, we've got the list of assets. We've got our threat and vulnerability pairs. We have our impact score. We have our likelihood score. So we're ready to actually calculate the risk. So for that users and eavesdropping, my impact score is 5. My likelihood score is 2. So now my risk score is a 10. Obviously, the higher the risk score, the more effort I want to put into protections. Okay. So how do we do the risk assessment? Well, up to now, we've just been collecting data. Now we're actually ready to start classifying things and saying whether the risk is high or low. And this is just, once again, it's an example of a matrix. You don't have to use this matrix. You can use whatever matrix works for you. Here's another example of a risk matrix. We look at the likelihood and the impact, which we just calculated. And we come up with a risk analysis. We take the risk classification and the total of scores, and we come up with risk score is 10, and our risk classification is moderate, based on our score that we came up with earlier. So then you compile your risks and your scores for each asset. And what that does is that helps put you into a posture of starting to understand, okay, for my assets, here is my real risk. This is where I need to focus my efforts. Part of your analysis is looking at, did you treat vulnerability pairs correctly? Is there anything missing? You now have information that you can sit down with functional owners of the software or the assets and say, look, this is the risk score that we came up with. Does this look right to you? It's an opportunity for you to educate some of your users, some of your other people. And then the other thing you want to look at too is, are there any industry standards out there that could impact those? So what's your game plan? How do you do this? First thing you do is a gap analysis, okay? Once your risk assessment is complete and your findings are documented, then you can take a look at the risk and say, all right, some of the ones we're going to avoid, we're going to get rid of that asset or we're going to offload it to somebody else. Sometimes we're going to mitigate those risks by adding controls. Transfer, we're going to transfer the risk to somebody else, or you just accept the risk. For example, if the risk to an asset, total impact of the organization is $10, you might decide you're going to accept that risk because it's worth $10. You know, the organization has to spend $10 to replace it. It's not a big deal. So for each of the assets you identify, whether you're going to avoid, accept, transfer, or mitigate the risks, what would the budget be required to do one of the above? What's the time frame for implementation? What resources would be required to implement it? And how long will it take you to get there? And what you do is you take this information, you add it to your strategic plan, because my guess is at the end of an information security risk assessment, you walk into your boss and say, hey boss, we need another $375,000 in the budget next year for risk mitigation. He's going to laugh at you, or she's going to laugh at you and say, you'll be lucky if you get $25. So when you walk in and hand them this report and say, look, this is the analysis we've done. These are the assets. These are the risks. This is what it's going to take to protect these assets. I think you need to take it to upper management, or maybe you are upper management, and just say, look, here's where we are. These are the risks. These are the probabilities of the risks. This is what it's going to cost to mitigate it. It informs you in terms of budgeting and planning. And that's really what it boils down to, is having the information you need. Instead of walking in and saying, hey, boss, I'd like to buy Stealth Watch to monitor the traffic on the network. It's going to be $100,000 a year. You okay with that? Or if you're the person who has to justify that expense, it's better to walk and say, look, we have a serious risk because we've got all these users accessing our network and we have no idea what's happening on the network. We need a way to monitor that traffic so that we can identify threats to the network before they become actual threats. It's going to cost us $100,000 a year, but it's worth it. That's where you have the conversation. What do you mean it's worth it? And you say, well, because if we get compromised, this is going to be the financial impact of the organization. You can, if you want, integrate your findings into the the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is a way, if you decide to do that, one of the things you can do is then share this information with other organizations to see how you rank. Okay. These are now the top 18 cybersecurity controls. You can use these to help inform you on some of the things you can do to put controls and protections in place for your assets. We went through this exercise last year, and it was very beneficial. We saw where we needed to refocus some of our energies. You can join the MS ISAC for free if you're a K-12 school district or other state or federal or tribe entity. They have all kinds of resources that are available to you. It includes a SOC operation. They'll watch your external IP addresses and let you know if they notice anything funny going on. They've got some great tools and resources. I highly recommend you. You can join this too if you're not a public entity, you're a private organization. You can also pay an annual membership fee. It's sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. So there's a lot of tremendous resources out there. So what are my final thoughts as I'm heading into my last few minutes of the presentation? After you complete the audit, you should have a complete inventory of all your assets. So in and of itself, that's a benefit to doing this. You'll have classified all of the information that you have, which is also a benefit to this exercise. You've identified all the controls that exist within your organization to help keep that, maintain that CII triad around that information. You also find out where you have gaps in your controls. You're going to identify your process and procedural shortcomings. Boy, I tell you what, just walking through the parts of this exercise, you'll see that right away. It'll also help you understand where you don't have the right documentation or where you don't have documentation at all. It helps you with budgeting. It helps you a lot with budgeting because now when you walk in for a budget, instead of saying, hey, we need to jump on the cybersecurity bandwagon like everybody else, you can say, look, over the next 5 years, this is where I think we need to be spending our money, and show that you have a plan, not just this year, but 5 years out. This is kind of a lower risk, so we don't really need to deal with this till maybe year 2 or 3, but these are the things that we need to do right away. Okay. And it also will help you identify systems that you may still have on site because no one wants to get rid of, that you don't need anymore. I recommend that you walk through this exercise. I have on here that you do this annually or biannually. I think every 2 years is okay, depending on your organization, depending on your size, maybe 3 years. But every time you have a major system upgrade, you should do this again, because it's not uncommon for putting in a major system upgrade or rolling out a major platform or making a significant change like adding 10,000 Chromebooks, where you have to rethink, okay, how do we do support? How do we provide support? How do we provide access? What kind of access are we providing? It asks a lot of questions. And whenever you have those major questions, that's when you should think, information security risk assessment. The other thing too is you don't have to do all of your organization for an information security risk assessment. If you've identified your assets and you have like 15 servers that are the crown jewels of your organization that you would be devastated if they got compromised, and you've got some medium servers that are, it would be a pain if you lost those, but it wouldn't be that critical to the organization. Some that, pick 1 or 2 servers and walk through this exercise with just those servers. That in and of itself will provide you with great information and experience to roll this out on a much larger scale. Pick one system, just pick one system and work through this whole audit process with just that one system, and work through it with your team so that they start to understand that when they're doing things, they've got to be thinking cybersecurity, they've got to be thinking, risk, they've got to be thinking these are the things that we should be looking toward. Just some references for you if you're interested. Information Security Risk Assessment Toolkit, IT Security Metrics, which is pretty good, ISAC, a Cybersecurity Audit Certification Study Guide, which is just a good document overall. At this point, I can't believe I got through that in 45 minutes. I'm open to questions if anybody has any questions. Does this assessment process include smartphones? If you consider them an asset that you manage, absolutely. Where I work, we don't provide phones to the staff. They just use their smartphones. So I'm not storing, there's no information that I'm storing, no information of record stored on any of the smartphones. So I don't include those in my audit. But if you're issuing smartphones to your employees, they're expected to use them for work, and there may be information on those smartphones that's important to you, then you should probably include them. Good question, Michelle. Thank you. So personal smartphones being used unofficially for work, if they're unofficially being used for work, they don't exist. What you need, and I say that in jest, so basically you need some kind of a policy in place that indemnifies you as an organization that if an employee has taken it upon themselves to put confidential information on their personal device, they violated some kind of a policy at work. Will they do that? Probably. Like I check my email, but I don't download any information to my smartphone when I check my email. If there's a document on there that I need to look at, I go to my computer and look at it. I don't pull it down to my smartphone. So it is and it isn't a gray area. If you talk to your attorney, he's going to tell you right away that you need some kind of a policy in place that employees have to sign and say they will not use their personal devices. They won't store any confidential information from work on their personal devices. So bring your own device policies. How would you affect a security risk assessment? So in that instance, what you're doing is you're going to investigate. So if I'm bringing my own device to work, most organizations now have a separate network that those devices connect to. And the assets internally that those devices have access to is controlled. So what you're going to do in terms of the information security risk assessment is you're going to look at those controls that are in place to limit what those personal devices can get to, if that makes sense. So you're not going to be looking at the personal devices. You're going to be looking at the methods that those personal devices use to connect to the network. Those devices, how protected are those avenues of ingress into your network? What rules are in place? Access control lists, if they're going through some kind of a firewall or VPN, what rules are set up so that their access, how is their access segmented from the rest of the network? Those are the kinds of things that you're going to look at. You can't, legally, I don't think you could want to be worried about investigating people's personal devices, their personal devices. Where I work, I have a completely separate network. anyone who brings in their BYOD device can connect to that separate network, and it's tunneled through my network right to the internet. They don't have access to internal resources on their personally owned devices, except through the internet, which is, if they were at home, how they would access some of those resources anyway. Would a multinational do assessments unit by unit overall? This is where things get really tricky. You would have to break that down by country and look at the rules that are at play for each of those countries. Like, for example, in the United States, I own the equipment. I can monitor the equipment anytime that I want to. I can take a look at what activities are occurring on that equipment. The GDPR over in Europe prohibits me from doing that. A lot of countries, I'm not allowed to look at what activity an individual user is doing on their device. Even though it's my device and it's my network, I'm not allowed to monitor them because it's considered a violation of privacy. What I can do is I can anonymize the data as it leaves or enters the network. And I can look at what's occurring on the network as long as I'm not pulling out individual data. It gets very tricky very fast. I have a friend who works for a pharmaceutical company, and he's doing audits all over the place, and he's just pulling his hair out because it's different. But what I would recommend, Michelle, is absolutely you come up with a process that works, and then you modify it for the countries that you're in. There are going to be some things that you can do and some things you can't do. Even with employee permission, there are some things you can't do in some countries based on the laws. My email address is up there on the screen right now. If you think of a question down the road later, feel free to email me. Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that.
Okay. We only